At this point, I have covered everything I know of the basic rules of Japanese Mahjong. However, throughout this video there have been many instances in which I mentioned a particular situation only being applicable in certain rules. Well, this is the part where I get to explain myself for those. There are many advanced rules and rule variations that are used locally throughout different regions of Japan and in different video games. Some video games may even allow you to set some of these rules for yourself. Keeping track of all of them can be quite cumbersome, but if you're playing your own casual game with other people, they're all things that you really do need to decide upon beforehand so that everyone knows what to do if a certain ambiguous situation arises. If you are playing a video game, or you're in some other environment with predetermined rules, you at least need to be aware of these variations so you can recognize which ones are in effect. Although some variations are used more commonly than others, it's almost impossible to define a standard default set of these variations that you should expect to see most often. But I will do my best to explain the advanced rules that you will most likely have to deal with. I'll also give my personal recommendations for which variations to use for your own games if you're just starting to learn them. But all of these settings are completely up to you, whichever you decide that you prefer. In Japanese, the words ari and nashi are usually used to refer to whether or not a certain variation is being used. Depending on the context of the rule, ari can mean present, valid, or in effect, while nashi can mean absent, invalid, or not in effect. Whether or not to replace some of the number 5 tiles in the game with the red number 5 tiles to count as extra Dora. Most Japanese Mahjong sets will come with 4 of them, and you can insert up to however many you like. Of course, I recommend playing with all 4 of them. You may choose to play with or without revealing additional Kan Dora indicators when a player creates a quad. If you play with Kan Dora present, you must choose the timing option for when to flip up the next Kan Dora indicator. One setting for this option is to always flip up the next indicator immediately after the dead wall draw occurs. This always affords the player who declared Kan the benefit of the new Dora indicator in the case of Rinshan Kaiho, or at least when choosing which tile to discard next. The other setting is to flip the next indicator immediately after the creation of a closed quad only. If an open quad or late quad is formed, the next indicator does not get flipped until after the player who declared Kan discards a tile to end their turn. Not only does this mean you don't get the extra Dora indicator for your Rinshan Kaiho, it also creates the possibility of you choosing a tile to discard only to find out too late that it was about to become a Dora. However, if an opponent calls Ron against your discard at this time, the Kan Dora indicator does not get flipped for them either. I recommend playing with Kan Dora and using the immediate timing option for all types of quads. You can choose whether or not a player who goes out after declaring reach gets to flip up the Ura Dora indicators before scoring their hand. Tiles marked by the Ura Dora indicators become additional Dora for the winning hand before its Han total is counted. If the Kan Dora indicators are in use, you may choose whether to use the Kan Ura Dora indicators as well. Only the Dora indicators that are face up at the end of a hand may have their Ura Dora indicators flipped. I recommend playing with all Ura Dora in use. Suucha Riichi. With this rule present, if all 4 players declare reach during a single hand, the hand becomes null after the 4th player to call reach discards a tile. The hand does not become null if another player calls Ron against the 4th player's discard. That player is allowed to preemptively win the hand. If the discard goes through and the null hand is invoked, all players are required to reveal their hands to confirm that they called reach while in Tenpai. If Suucha Riichi is absent, then nothing special happens after the 4th player calls reach, and the hand continues as normal. Whether or not you play with this rule depends on if you want to give the last remaining player that kind of veto power, so to speak. If you don't want the hand to end in a disappointing anticlimax after all 4 players are just waiting to go out, try playing without it. Sanchaho. If 3 players win a hand simultaneously, either by calling Ron on the same discard or by Nagashi Mangan, this rule declares that nobody wins, and the result is a null hand. If you play without this rule, there are other settings you need to decide on for what does happen, which I'll cover later. I do recommend a null hand in the event of a triple win, though, for the sake of simplicity. Sukaikan. This is the rule that determines whether a null hand is invoked if 2 or more players have created a total of 4 or more quads during a single hand. However, there are a few different implementations of each setting that you need to decide on. If Sukaikan is present, then the hand becomes null once the 4th quad has been formed. In one variation, the hand becomes null immediately, before the player draws from the dead wall. This prevents the player who formed the 4th quad from having a chance to win by Rinshan Kaiho. In the other variation, the player is allowed to continue their turn, and may go out off the dead wall if possible. But if the player finishes the turn by discarding a tile, and if no other player calls that tile to win, then the hand becomes null. Another player may call the discard for an open meld at this time, but you're really only putting yourself at a disadvantage if you do so, because then the responsibility of making the last safe discard falls to you. If Sukaikan is absent, the hand continues as normal even after the 4th quad is made. However, it is now impossible for any more quads to be formed because there are no extra tiles left in the dead wall. The tiles added onto the other end from the live wall don't count. They must always stay dead. Again, there are 2 possible variations on this setting. In the first variation, no player is allowed to declare Kan under any circumstances for the rest of the hand. Doing so would be considered an erroneous call, resulting in a dead hand. In the second variation, a player is allowed to declare Kan for a 5th time, but this causes the hand to become null immediately. Remember that it is permissible for 1 player to call Kan 4 times in one hand. This case only should always be treated as if Sukaikan is absent. So whether you play with Sukaikan or not, you always need to decide on one of the rule variations for its absence. If a player calls Ron to claim Chankan against any quad that would result in a null hand for any reason, Chankan always takes precedence. I recommend playing with Sukaikan present, with the null hand invoked after the player's safe discard. If 1 player forms 4 quads, I recommend using the rule that disallows the other players from calling Kan again. Kyuushu Kyuuhai. This rule determines if a player can choose to reveal their hand on their first turn and declare a null hand immediately, if their starting hand contains at least 9 different types of terminal and honor tiles, and if no other player has called Pon, Chi, or Kan first. If valid, this action is allowed. If invalid, it is not allowed, and the player must play the hand as normal. Trying to call Kyuushu Kyuuhai in this case would be considered an illegal exposure of hand tiles, resulting in a dead hand. I recommend playing with Kyuushu Kyuuhai valid, because hey, even with a 9-tile head start, Kokushi Musou is still really hard to do. Suufon Renta. If this rule is present, a null hand occurs if all 4 players discard a copy of the same wind tile on the first 4 turns of the hand. It can be any one of the 4 types of wind tiles, as long as all 4 players discard the same type. If the tiles are distributed such that it is possible for this situation to play out, it would not be possible to interrupt with a call. If Suufon Renta is absent, nothing special happens in this case. The opportunity for Suufon Renta only lasts for the very first go-around of a hand. If any player breaks the sequence, or the dealer does not start it, 4 consecutive discards of the same wind tile does not cause anything special for the rest of the hand. I actually recommend playing with this rule, because it provides a way for the players to come to a subtle agreement that the tiles could stand to be reshuffled if everyone's hand is crap. Of course, if the 4th player opts not to discard their copy of the wind tile on the first turn, watch out for them. Kui-kai, literally, eat and switch. This rule governs the discarding of certain types of tiles on the same turn that you called a tile for an open meld. There are 3 variations on this rule. If kui-kai is valid, you are allowed to discard the same type of tile you called that turn if you already had a copy of it in your hand. For example, calling a red 5 pin to complete an open 5, 6, 7 pin sequence and then immediately discarding the normal 5 pin you already had. This applies to both open triplets and open sequences. If kui-kai is invalid for the same tile only, you may not do this. But if you had, say, a 6, 7, 8 pin sequence already in your hand, you could still call the 5 pin and then discard the 8 pin. If kui-kai is fully invalid, you may not discard either type of tile, because both could have completed the now open sequence. Violating this rule invokes a dead hand penalty. The rule against kui-kai lasts for 1 turn only. On your next turn, any tiles affected by your previous call become legal to discard. If you would like my recommendation, try playing with the same tile only variation. Karaten. The term refers to the state of being in tenpai for a hand that's impossible to complete, because all of your weights are already face up on the table, either in open melds, closed quads, discard piles, or in the dead wall as door indicators. The rule of karaten affects whether or not a player in this state is allowed to call tenpai at the end of a drawn hand. If karaten is valid, you are allowed to call tenpai with a karaten hand. If it's invalid, you are not. Some variations may specify locations of tiles for where karaten is valid or not individually. For example, if at least one of your weights are in a discard pile, your karaten is valid. But if they are all in open melds, closed quads, or the dead wall, your karaten is invalid. This is actually the variation I recommend. Atozuke. Roughly speaking, this rule determines how soon your hand must meet the minimum requirement of having at least 1 yaku, and it affects whether or not you are allowed to go out when you draw a tile that completes your hand, or an opponent discards one. If Atozuke is absent, then if your hand does not already have a guaranteed yaku of its own, you are not allowed to go out, even if adding the winning tile to your hand would create a yaku. Calling the tile in this case would be considered an infraction worthy of chonbo. With Atozuke present, you are allowed to call the winning tile in such a circumstance. The yaku you create is considered to satisfy your hand's 1 yaku minimum requirement at the last second. Sometimes you may hear the rule referred to by its opposite name of sakizuke, or kanzen sakizuke. Present and absent have the opposite implications in that case. This rule does not apply to situational yaku such as closed tsumo. Those yaku are always allowed to be credited to your hand at the last second by their very nature. Look at an example. This hand's composition is 1 tile away from having a large straight. However, this is not a guaranteed yaku because the hand is actually in a 2-sided weight on both the 6-so and the 3-so. Completing the hand with a 3-so would not provide any yaku. Therefore, if sakizuke is in effect, then even if an opponent discards the 6-so, this hand would not be allowed to go out on it. Likewise, because the hand is open, it may not go out after drawing a 6-so from the wall. However, if, for example, the opponent who took the last turn of the hand discarded the 6-so, this hand would be able to go out on that tile, because calling Ron on the last discard is the situational Yaku Ho Te Rao Yui, and it gets credited to the hand immediately. After going out, the hand would be awarded both Ho Te Rao Yui and large straight. Now, suppose the same hand was not in a two-sided weight on the 3-6-so, but a closed weight on the 5-so. In this case, the large straight Yaku is guaranteed because there is no other way for the hand to go out, and no possible alternate configuration of the tiles. This hand may now go out as soon as a 5-so is available. Now look here. This is where Sakizuke starts to get tricky. This hand is in a set weight on two types of dragon tiles. You might think that going out on either tile would guarantee the hand an honor sets Yaku, and you're right. But remember, each set of a different type of honor tile is actually its own distinct Yaku. If this hand goes out on the red dragon, it would not have the same Yaku as if it went out on the green dragon. And in one possible variation, the rule of Sakizuke does not state that your hand must be guaranteed just any Yaku before going out. It states that a hand must have at least one specific guaranteed Yaku in order to go out. Namely, at least one Yaku that is guaranteed to be awarded to the hand no matter which of its weights it goes out on. Because the red dragon and green dragon sets are treated as different Yaku, neither is technically guaranteed for the hand. The presence of Sakizuke may not permit this hand to go out without a situational Yaku. As you can see, the rule of Sakizuke has a tendency to make things quite complicated. And the complications are in fact not limited to the examples I've just shown you. I recommend playing with Otozuke, as this is one of the most commonly used variations. The double Ron rule determines what happens in case two players try to call Ron on the same discard. If double Ron is absent, the calling player who is closest to the discarding player in counterclockwise order gets priority for the win over the other player, and the discarding player is required to pay the value of that player's hand only. If double Ron is present, then both players win, and the discarding player must pay each winner the value of their respective hand. However, in the presence of double Ron, there are a few additional things you have to decide on. Who receives the extra payment from the bonus sticks? It can either be added to both winning players' scores, or added to the nearest counterclockwise player's score only. If the dealer was one of the winning players, whether or not a dealer keep occurs. You can choose to have it always occur, because the dealer was one of the winners, never occur, because a non-dealer was one of the winners, or base it on whether or not the dealer was the nearest counterclockwise player. Those are the only two extra settings you have to choose. If there are any reach bets on the table, they are always all claimed by the nearest counterclockwise player. In order to simplify matters at first, I recommend playing with double Ron absent. In addition to two players trying to call Ron on the same tile, it is possible, although rare, for three players to try to call Ron on the same tile. This is subject to the rule of triple Ron. The exact same possible settings and conditions for double Ron also exist for triple Ron, and you can choose the settings for each rule individually. Remember though, in the case of triple Ron, you may also choose to take a third option and declare a null hand. This is the option I recommend. Remember that if you play with double Ron or triple Ron present, there are special scoring rules in the event of a double or triple Nagashi Mangan. Those are covered in its own section of the video in the Yaku chapter. Ryanhan Shibari. If this rule is present, then during any hand in which there are 5 or more bonus sticks on the table, a player's hand must have at least 2 Han worth of Yaku, not Dora, in order to be able to go out. The hand may still receive Han for Dora tiles as normal, but if less than 2 of the hand's total Han come from Yaku, The hand is not allowed to go out. Trying to go out without satisfying this extra condition is considered an invalid declaration of a win, resulting in chonbo. If Ryanhan Shibari is absent, this 2-han minimum never comes into effect. Ryanhan Shibari does not affect a player's ability to call Tenpai at the end of a drawn hand. Try playing with this rule absent at first. Choose how many points each player will start the game with. In the most common scoring rules, each player starts with 25,000 points, or some other amount between 20,000 and 30,000. You can increase or decrease this amount as you wish, or you can distribute the starting points unevenly to give certain players a handicap. You can choose how many total points are exchanged after a drawn hand between the players in Tenpai and the players not in Tenpai. It should be a number divisible by 600 so that it can be split both 50-50 or between 1 and 3 players as necessary. You can also choose to play without a No Tenpai penalty, although you still need to perform the step at the end of a drawn hand. In most rules, the total No Tenpai penalty is 3,000 points. You can choose how many total points each bonus stick on the table adds to the total value of a winning hand, or choose to play without bonus sticks. The value should be a multiple of 300. In most rules, it is 300. 1500 is another commonly used value. Kiriage Mangan. The basic point calculations for a winning hand with 4 han and 30 fu, or 3 han and 60 fu, both work out to 1,920 points. Normally, the rank of Mangan is only awarded to a hand when its basic point calculation would exceed 2,000. But 1920 points really is almost Mangan, and that's why the rule of Kiriage Mangan exists. If it's in effect, a basic point score of 1920 gets rounded up to 2,000 before payment calculation occurs, and the hand becomes Mangan by approximation. If not in effect, the basic points are not rounded, and the minimum requirements for Mangan remain 5 han, 4 han 40 fu, or 3 han 70 fu. Try playing without Kiriage Mangan. You must choose how many fu are awarded to a double-wind pair. Recall that when counting a winning hand's fu, 2 fu are awarded if the hand's pair is of wind tiles that match the current round wind or the winning player's seat wind. If the player's seat wind is the same as the round wind, a pair of matching wind tiles can be worth 2 fu or 4 fu. Because the double wind Yaku always works the same way, I recommend playing with a double wind pair worth 4 fu to avoid confusion. Wareme. This rule dubs the player whose wall was broken at the beginning of the hand as the wareme. If the hand is won by any player, any payment calculations involving the wareme are doubled. This is true whether the wareme wins or loses. If the wareme loses, their payment only is doubled. If the wareme wins, all losing players have their payments doubled. The doubling occurs before bonus sticks have been applied to the calculations. So for example, if a non-dealer calls Tsumo and scores Mangan on a hand with 1 bonus stick, the dealer owes 4,100 points, the other non-dealer owes 2,100 points, and the wareme owes 4,100 points. But if the wareme was the dealer and called Ron on the same hand with a Mangan, the discarding player would owe 24,300 points. This is a very risky rule, and I don't recommend playing with it at first. Sekinin Barai, also called the Pao rule. This is a difficult rule that can be applied to certain Yakuman hands. Sekinin Barai activates if a player assembles a collection of open melds during a single hand that guarantees a Yakuman. Then, if that player goes out, the player who discarded into the last open meld necessary to ensure the Yakuman is always responsible for a portion of the winning player's payment, no matter how they went out. The dangerous discard has made that player liable for the Yakuman. If the winning player went out off the wall, the liable player must pay the entire amount of the hand, while the other losing players pay nothing. Payment calculation is treated as if the winning player had called loan against the liable player. If the winning player went out by calling loan against a different player, payment calculation occurs normally, but the result is split 50-50 between the liable player and the discarding player. In this case, though, there is some contention over who is responsible for paying the amount of the bonus sticks, because splitting them 50-50 may result in a number that's not a multiple of 100. The consensus appears to be that the discarding player is still responsible for all of the bonus stick points. As an example, suppose that during a hand with 3 bonus sticks, the Southwind player has this hand with 2 open sets of dragon tiles. Although the remainder of the hand's composition is incomplete now, one more red dragon would make the hand sufficient to claim the big 3 dragons Yakuman if it was able to go out. Clearly, red dragon is a very dangerous tile for the other players to discard at this point. But suppose the Northwind player declared reach and has no choice but to discard a red dragon, allowing the South player to complete the 3rd open set. Now, South is guaranteed to have a Yakuman hand after going out, and the North player is the one responsible. Under the rule of Sekinin Barai, if South goes out by calling Tsumo, North must pay all 4 multiples of the basic points that South would be owed from all players, 32,000 points. With the bonus sticks applied, the South player's payment becomes 32,900 points. This is the same situation as if South had gone out by calling loan against North. However, if South goes out by calling loan against the dealer instead, North is still responsible for a portion of the payment. The dealer's payment is calculated to be 32,000 points as normal, and this is split evenly between the dealer and the North player. Having been the one to discard into the final winning hand, the dealer still pays the total amount of the bonus sticks. North pays 16,000 points and the dealer pays 16,900 points. As a general rule, the only Yakuman hands that Sekinin Barai may be applied to are big 3 dragons, big 4 winds, and 4 quads. This is because they are the only Yakuman that can be guaranteed through open melds alone. For all other Yakuman that allow open melds, the Yakuman would still not be guaranteed after the formation of the 4th open meld because the hand's pair has yet to be decided. For example, opening these 4 sets of terminal tiles is not enough to guarantee you the all terminals Yakuman, because you still need one more pair of terminal tiles to qualify for the hand. One thing to note in the case of 4 quads. The previous 3 quads do not need to have been open in order for opening a 4th quad to invoke Sekinin Barai. Closed and late quads still count towards ensuring the Yakuman by virtue of having been set aside. The 4th quad must still be open, of course, or there is no one to call the rule against. Sekinin Barai becomes more complicated if multiple Yakuman are scored in the same hand. In that case, payment calculations for Sekinin Barai must be performed separately from payment calculations for the regular Yakuman. Let's add all honors onto the previous example and watch what happens. This hand is now worth a total of 16,000 basic points, but they must be split into the 8,000 basic points from the regular all honors Yakuman and the 8,000 basic points from the big 3 dragons on which Sekinin Barai has been invoked. Suppose the Southwind player went out off the wall again. Payments are calculated in the regular fashion for all honors, with the non-dealers owing 8,000 points and the dealer owing 16,000 points. Then, the liability payment is calculated for the player sitting north, who owes all 32,000 of the basic points from big 3 dragons. With the 3 bonus sticks, the final payments are 8,300 points for the West player, 16,300 points for the dealer, and 40,300 points for the North player, for a total of 64,900 points. Now, if South went out off the dealer would owe all 32,000 points from all honors, but only 16,000 points from Big Three Dragons. With the bonus sticks, the dealer owes a total of 48,900 points. North still owes the remaining 16,000 points. In addition to the aforementioned Yakuman hands, Ryanhan Kaiho is another case in which it is possible to apply the rule of Sekinin Barai. Specifically, if you call Kan against an opponent's discard to form an open quad, and then on the same turn you go out off the dead wall to achieve Ryanhan Kaiho, the player who discarded into your open quad becomes liable for your win. That player must pay the entire amount of points for your hand as if you had called Ron against them. You do not need to go out off the dead wall draw of the same quad you opened. You may continue to form multiple quads in a row. Sekinin Barai is invoked as long as you go out off the dead wall on the same turn. Here's an example. Suppose the dealer is in Tenpai with this hand, no bonus sticks on the table. The player sitting west discards the final white dragon tile, and the dealer calls Kan on it to form an open quad. Then the dealer draws the last one pin from the dead wall, and adds it to the open set for a late quad. Drawing from the dead wall again, the dealer gets a 5 so, which completes this hand, Tsumo. The dealer has now invoked Sekinin Barai against the West player. So instead of scoring the hand as a Tsumo, it is scored as a Ron against West. The hand has 60 Fu, and 2 Han from the Yaku White Dragon and Ryanhan Kaiho. 960 basic points. West pays the dealer 6 times the basic points, which is rounded up to 5,800. You may choose to play with or without Sekinin Barai in effect. If it is in effect, you may also choose whether it applies to Yakuman hands, Ryanhan Kaiho, or both. If you want my recommendation, try applying it to Ryanhan Kaiho only at first. Decide whether or not you're going to play with any optional Yaku. One sequence triplet, sequence of sets, and Nagashi Mangan are the ones I've covered. But there are more optional Yaku out there than just the ones I'm most familiar with, and if you learn any more of them, you're welcome to try using as many of them as you like. Keep in mind that there may be additional options you have to set for some of the Yaku, like deciding how many Han one sequence triplet is worth. I recommend leaving these Yaku out at first. Kuitan. This rule determines whether Tanyao, the no terminals and honors Yaku, may be awarded to an open hand, that is to say, a hand that has eaten discarded tiles. If Kuitan is valid, an open hand receives credit for satisfying no terminals and honors. If Kuitan is invalid, it does not. Kuitan valid is a widely used variation, and I recommend it. Sometimes you might hear a rule set briefly described as being ari-ari or nashi-nashi. These are usually referring to the settings for Kuitan and Atozuke. Pinfu Tsumo, also known as Pinzumo. This rule determines whether a closed hand that goes out off the wall is allowed to claim the no-fu Yaku. Recall that under normal circumstances, going out off the wall provides 2 fu to your hand. If Pinfu Tsumo is invalid, those 2 fu mean that you have not technically satisfied the no-fu requirement of the Yaku, and your hand does not receive credit for it. At worst, you'll have to settle for the closed Tsumo Yaku alone with 1 Han and 30 fu. If Pinfu Tsumo is valid, then if you have satisfied all the other requirements of no fu, the 2 fu of Tsumo do not get awarded to your hand, allowing you to claim the Yaku with the base 20 Fu and a minimum of 2 Han. I recommend playing with this rule valid. How many Han and Fu to award for 7 pairs? A 7 pairs hand is able to accumulate more Han through Dora and other Yaku, but it always has a fixed amount of Fu. Usually the Yaku is worth 2 Han and the hand is worth 25 Fu. But you can also choose to play with the Yaku worth 1 Han and the hand 50 Fu. The basic point calculation works out the same either way, since all the latter option really does is move a multiplication by 2 from the Han over to the Fu. But it does mean that the 7 pairs Yaku alone would now be unable to meet the 2 Han minimum requirement of Ryanhan Shibari. Try using 2 Han and 25 Fu for 7 pairs hands. Choose whether or not you're going to play with any optional Yakuman, which again there exist more than the Hand of Mankind, 4 sequential sets, big wheels, and 8 consecutive wins that I've shown you. And don't forget about the other options you may have to set for some of those Yakuman, especially in the case of 8 consecutive wins. I also recommend not playing with these at first. Choose which of the double Yakuman hands you want to recognize, if any. A double Yakuman adds 2 multiples of the basic point limit to the winning hand score instead of 1. The double Yakuman you have to choose from are 4 closed sets pair weight, big 4 wins, 9 perfect gates, Kokushi Musou 13-way weight, and big 7 stars. Refer to their explanations in the Yakuman chapter for details. You can pick any subset out of the list that you want to play with. Or you can play without any double Yakuman at all. But I recommend playing with all of them except for big 7 stars, which isn't as commonly used. You can choose whether or not a hand that satisfies multiple Yakuman is allowed to accumulate multiples of the basic point limit. If combined Yakuman are invalid, a winning hand that satisfies any Yakuman at all is always awarded a flat 8,000 basic points, or possibly 16,000 points if you're using double Yakuman. If combined Yakuman are valid, then the basic point limit is multiplied by the number of Yakuman the hand has, with each double Yakuman adding 2 multiples. If you don't want combined Yakuman to be a total game breaker, you can play without them, but as rarely as they happen, I can recommend playing with them. Decide whether or not Ron may be called against a closed quad to complete a Kokushi Musou hand. Refer to the Kokushi Musou section of the video for details. I recommend allowing it. You may change the minimum requirements that the dealer must meet at the end of a hand in order to cause a dealer keep. There are 3 possible settings for this rule. If the minimum requirement is win, the dealer can only cause a dealer keep by winning the hand. If the minimum requirement is tenpai, dealer keep occurs if the dealer wins or if the dealer calls tenpai at the end of a drawn hand. And if the minimum requirement is no tenpai, then there is a dealer keep if the dealer wins or after any drawn hand. Some rules might even use different settings depending on the current round. The nominal setting for this rule is tenpai. Try playing with that. Dobon. This rule governs whether the game ends when a player has lost too many points. If Dobon is in effect, the game is immediately over after a hand in which one or more players' scores have become negative, or sometimes fallen to 0. You'll have to choose. If Dobon is not in effect, the game continues with the player or players in a negative balance of points, and the game doesn't end until all rounds have been finished. Whether or not you use this rule depends on how long you want to keep playing. But if you want to avoid the hassle of having to keep track of negative scores, especially if you're using point sticks, I recommend playing with it. Agari Yame. This is a rule involving dealer keeps that occur on the final hand of a game. The idea is that if the current dealer is in the lead when such a dealer keep occurs, there is no logical reason why they would want to play an extra hand and risk losing their lead. So, if Agari Yame is in effect, the dealer may choose to declare that the game is set, and end the game without having another dealer keep hand. Video games in particular may often enforce this decision automatically. If Agari Yame is not in effect, the last hand must be repeated until it does not end in a dealer keep, or until some other condition for the end of the game is met. I do recommend playing with Agari Yame in effect. Oka. This rule is related to the point baseline that you use when doing the final scoring at the end of a game. If Oka is absent, the baseline will be the same as the starting amount of points for each player. If Oka is present, the baseline will be higher than the player's starting points. For example, if all players start with 25,000 points, the Oka rule could make the point baseline 30,000 points instead. What this effectively does is assume that all players started the game with 30,000 points, equal to the baseline, but each player had to buy into the game by paying 5,000 points into a jackpot of sorts. The result is that each player starts the game with 25,000 points, and there are 20,000 points in the jackpot, which get awarded to the winner at the end of the game. This jackpot is what is referred to as Oka in Japanese. I didn't mention anything about the Oka rule in the final scoring section of the video. The reason for that is, there was no need to bring it up then, because the calculation method used in the example I gave always works out the same way whether or not you're playing with Oka. Now I'd like to revisit that example to show you the details of how it all works out. Let's skip to the part where everyone's points have been rounded to the nearest thousand. First place has 57,000 points. Second place has 32,000 points. Third place has 19,000 points. And fourth place has -8,000 points. Assume each player started with 25,000 points. If Oka is absent, then the point baseline is also 25,000 points, and that's what everyone's score is compared to in order to determine final scoring. Doing the math, second place has +7, third place has -6, and fourth place has -33. If you do the same calculation for first place as well, you'll see that first place is at +32. This also happens to be the negative sum of the other three players' final scores. Now let's assume that Oka is present, and the point baseline being used is 30,000. This time, the final scores for second, third, and fourth place work out to +2, -11, and -38, respectively. First place works out to only +27. But remember, the 30,000 point baseline compared to the 25,000 starting points means all four players paid 5,000 points into the jackpot at the beginning of the game. That jackpot is now awarded to the first place player, and those 20,000 points become an extra +20 for their score, making it +47. This value happens to be the negative sum of the other player's final scores once again. This is why the negative sum calculation method is preferred for the first place player's score. That way you don't have to do anything differently whether or not you're playing with Oka. And for this reason, I don't really have a recommendation for whether or not you play with it. You can use whatever point baseline you'd like. Just remember that the baseline should be equal to or greater than the starting point amount, or else it doesn't make sense. Uma. This is a final exchange of points that occurs after final scoring has been performed. If this rule is used, it is typically something like +10 for first place, +5 for second place, -5 for third place, and -10 for fourth place. You can actually use whatever adjustment values you want for Uma, but they must always follow these rules. A lower-ranked player may not have a higher adjustment than a higher-ranked player, and the sum of all players' adjustments must be 0. You might see this rule used in some places, but I wouldn't recommend using it for yourself at first. That's all for the rules I have to share with you. Again, this is by no means intended to be an exhaustive list, but it should be enough to get you started. There are many more local Yaku, rules, and variations beyond the ones I'm familiar with that I've covered here, and I encourage you to take advantage of any number of resources on the internet where you can learn more. But of course, not all of them aren't in Japanese, and sometimes you really have to go searching for the good ones. I created this video with the intent of consolidating some of the essential information into a detailed visual walkthrough. My only hope is that it leaves you better prepared to enjoy Japanese Mahjong, and learn as much as you want to about it.